Does this supplement have harmful carbs? Maybe even the most dangerous carbs? It's on the shelves right now and you might even be using it. I'll show you how I came to this conclusion based on my own research involving some of the most catabolic people we've ever had on the planet. I offer that without exaggeration. So we'll break it all down. You're going to be the local expert and you might be able to help somebody that you know is using this product. So we got a lot to get to. Let's jump right in.
3, 2, 1.
I'm David Barr, and if you're looking to get bigger, faster, stronger, get leaner, go longer, hit that subscribe and then the little bell so you don't miss any important updates. And I'm going to one-up it because if you think that objective evidence is a better way to gather information than special feelings, then be sure to help advance the conversation and share this video. So what are we talking about? And to really understand the details, you need to be the local expert. This is going to take a minute, so hang in there. There's learning and it's worth it. So if you've ever had blood sugar taken, fasting serum glucose, that's really just taking the amount of sugar in your blood. Blood sugar, glucose, dextrose, it's all the same thing, okay? And all carbohydrates that we consume are broken down to this blood sugar, ultimately stored as glycogen in muscle, but we're all on the same page when we talk about glucose or blood glucose, okay? We'll talk about glucose specifically right now because it doesn't have to be digested, it can just be absorbed. So it'll make things a little simpler. You may have even done this when taking finger pricks to see what your blood glucose levels are. And if you did this when you're fasted, they're going to be relatively low. Once you consume, say, 50 grams of glucose, you're going to notice over time that your blood glucose levels start to go up. Why? Because it's being absorbed from your gut going into your blood. Now, it keeps going up for a while and then it starts to come down. Why is that? Well, it's because it's being absorbed or taken up into muscle. It's being transported into your muscle, mostly. All cells need glucose, but our muscle's the biggest sink, especially if you lift. So again, this is a standard curve that we see. Now, if we were to take in fewer than 50 grams, we would see a very similar curve, but it would be a lot lower. Why? Because we're not consuming as many carbs. We're not consuming as much glucose. Now, what if we consumed 100 grams of carbs, twice our initial dose? Well, you're going to see a much higher rise and slightly longer duration in that curve. Why? Because the area reflects the amount of carbohydrates that we consume, especially when we're just talking glucose right now. Okay, so we have the lower dose, 25 grams. That's going to be a smaller rise in glucose. The bump isn't going to be as high. 50 grams is more, it's going to be higher, right? So you see how this progresses. The more we consume, the higher it is. Now, what if we were to consume, say, 50 grams of a slow absorbing carbohydrate, like a waxy maize starch? Then we would see a much longer curve, but it's not going to go up quite as high. Why? Because it's more of a trickle effect. It's more of a slow absorption into the blood. But the net area is going to be roughly the same, that area under that curve, showing that, yeah, it's about 50 grams of carbohydrate. Well, if we consumed a magical faster than glucose carbohydrate, 50 grams, well, you're going to have a higher spike, but it's going to come down much more quickly. Again, the net area is going to be about roughly the same because it's going to be 50 grams. So again, that net area is going to reflect the total amount. Now, this is where it gets interesting because this is where it comes back to the research on catabolic patients. Irrespective of their growth hormone use, they were using a lot of substances to keep them as healthy as possible, keep them alive. And what we saw was that they had something called insulin resistance. Now, a curve showing insulin resistance, and people have this type of test. You might know it as an OGTT. Really important test, especially for people who are suspected of having type 2 diabetes. Very, very important for them to get this type of test. And the curve would look like this. They would have an initial rise in that blood glucose. Let's go back to 50 grams of glucose that they're consuming. They would have that initial rise in blood glucose, but it stays up and it stays up and it stays elevated for longer. Why is that? Well, they have problems getting the sugar into their cells, especially into their muscle cells. Okay, so remember that the curve is not only just based on the amount that's coming in to the blood, it's also about how much is leaving the blood, and that's the trick. That's a flaw with something called glycemic index. I'll cover that in another video in the future, but right now, know that people with the type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance, aren't taking up the glucose as well as healthy people like you or I. So what we're seeing ultimately is that this curve, this glucose curve, even though they're taking in the same amount of glucose that you and I are, they're having an extended curve. It looks much higher. It actually looks like they're consuming much more carbohydrate because they can't get it into their cells. They can get it into the blood, but they can't get it out of the blood very easily. So this is where there's a problem with this supplement. Now, this supplement actually claims this on their label. I don't know if they still do, but actually when I had this ingredient, this supplement, they actually showed this curve, this blood glucose curve. And what they showed was they had a slightly faster rise in blood glucose compared to glucose, the same amount of glucose, okay? They had a slightly faster rise and then a longer release, a longer curve. Now, if they are consuming the same amount of carbohydrate as the glucose, what does this curve look like? If they are consuming the same quantity of carbs, what does this curve look like? What do we just see? Well, it looks like the type 2 diabetic curve. It looks like the insulin resistance curve. So this is where we get into the possibility that these carbs in this supplement are not only potentially harmful carbs, but maybe even the most dangerous carbs if they are somehow inducing insulin resistance. Now, their claim is that they have different types of carbs with slower release and faster release. So you combine them and then you get this magic curve. But we wouldn't see that, right? Remember going back to the total area under that curve? That's going to reflect the amount of carbohydrate consumed. So we're not seeing that with this carb. They're showing us that they are somehow inducing insulin resistance because if the carbohydrate had fast and slow release and it was the same amount and wasn't inducing insulin resistance, the curve would be lower, right? Just like we saw with the different speeds of absorption, like that waxy maize starch. The net area under the curve reflects the amount of carbohydrate consumed, except for in disease states. Okay, and this is again where we see this type of curve is in the most catabolic people that I've ever seen, as well as people with type 2 diabetes and insulin resistant. So is this carbohydrate causing insulin resistance? And if so, we need to know. The company needs to explain this. Now, the problem with this is a potentially litigious situation because I'm the first person to report on this and I don't want to get sued. So I can't actually mention the name of the company. So I encourage you, do your due diligence. If you are looking at a carbohydrate product, look at their curve. If you see this curve that's higher than the same amount of glucose, call the company, see what's going on, have them explain it. Now, someone suggested to me, maybe the company wasn't as high fidelity in terms of their research. Maybe they thought this would be a good marketing idea to show this, so maybe it's not a real curve. To me, that would actually be the best situation because if not, again, they are causing insulin resistance, at least it appears to. So again, we don't want these potentially harmful carbs or even the most dangerous carbs in our body. So do your due diligence. Make sure you know what you're putting in your body. Hold companies accountable for what they're doing and the claims they make. Now, when reviewing an ingredient or supplement, I usually have a 3-point checklist that you can use to decide whether or not you want to use a product. In this case, I'm not going to do that. I mean, not only is it potentially harmful, as indicated by the company themselves, there's no peer-reviewed published research on it, of course. I mean, if there were, it would probably be showing that it's potentially harmful. So this is not one of those things I'm going to review in that way. It's just one of those things. Find out what's going on. Find out why we can't get the carbohydrates that we ingest into our blood when we consume this supplement. Now, let's be clear. If you're pissed off about this, and you probably should be, you have every right to contact the company and let them know how you feel. You're not powerless. In fact, you hold all the power. I've done this before, reported on a potentially dangerous ingredient, and a company changed their formulation. But it wasn't just because of me, it was because of the response. The consumer has the power. Let the company know how you feel. It's only by your action that things are going to change. So consider this to be your call to action. Let the company know. So if you found this information helpful, share it with someone. They just might owe you a protein shake. I'm David Barr, and until next time, raise the bar.